So, good morning, everybody. My name is Siobhan Quinlivan. I'm a lecturer here in the university, in the law school. And I'm very pleased to chair this session on the fourth day of the summer school. So the focus today is on disabled people as they navigate involvements in broader social justice movements. So as they try to build cross-movement solidarity and seek to exercise the right to participate in public and political life at all levels. So I'm really pleased to chair this first session, which is called Working on the Fringes of Movements. And I hope the session will inform us and people involved in social justice movements generally how to be inclusive of all identities. We have three speakers today: Andrea Parra from Colombia, Kaya Peterson from Norway. That's right. I just confused me there because you came from Sweden. So and Jennifer Byrne from Ireland. I'll provide each speaker's bio just before they speak. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, Andrea Parra, who's going to be joining us virtually. And Andrea is an attorney, queer feminist, legal activist, an experiential trainer and translator. She holds a law degree from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, and an LLM in American law from Boston University. And she's been admitted to practice as a lawyer in both New York and in Colombia. She's the co-director of the ALCE, which is an anti-punitive initiative striving to end psychiatric violence in Colombia. She has significant experience as a trainer and has worked as a director of the Latin American Network of Trainers, as well as being a core trainer with Training for Change. She has a lot of experience. She's worked with various human rights agencies, including the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Bridges O'Neill Institute, amongst others. And she's also held various roles over her career, including the advocacy director of the India-based feminist organisation CREE, practitioner in residence and clinical professor in immigrant justice in the clinic of the Washington College of Law at American University, and the Director of Action Programme for Equality, Social Inclusion, and here she directed the Gender Justice Observatory and worked on projects that were related to migrant women and the implementation of international human rights standards in sexual and reproductive rights advocacy. We are absolutely delighted that Andrea is here to speak with us today, and I'm going to open the floor to her via the technicians. They're going to do the actual technical bit.
I wish I could be there live and have live discussions, but I'll be checking the Discord and hopefully we can continue on the conversations. I want to thank Eleanor Flynn and the whole team of the summer school for the invitation, and also just wish I could be there in person. Eleanor has been an accomplice for many years in this journey of disability justice struggle. So I'm very glad to share with you a little bit of what I've learned in this journey about what's going on with care policies and that are a hot topic in Latin America. They're happening in many countries, and a little bit of how we began. First, I'd like to say that I'm co-director of ALCE. We are a grassroots collective in Colombia fighting psychiatric violence. And with regards to care, we have a mutual support group, and we are interested in discussing what does peer support enabled by state systems can look like. So I want to share a presentation because it's more of a story of how things have happened in this specific advocacy area. So I began poking at it because in the last run for mayor in Bogota, the winner was Claudia Lopez. And this is the previous term, we have a new mayor now. But her main platform was to develop a citywide care system. This was her main campaign point, to ensure that women's unpaid work was recognized and acknowledged, and providing respite to mainly female caretakers. And of course, this is a reflection of a feminist demand that had happened for decades about recognizing feminization of domestic work, care work, and the fact that it is unpaid in the majority of countries, which of course it's a great goal. And what happens in that debate is that the disability perspective, meaning mainly the people who are receiving care and supports, are outside of the conversation. So about 5 years ago, when this first policy began, we started pushing with a group of advocates, mainly independent living advocates in Colombia, and people who have worked on autonomy, many of them women with disabilities. We started trying to have meetings with the Secretary of Women's Mayor's Office. The Secretary of Women's was the one in charge of implementing a proposal for the care system. And we held meetings. We said, you cannot dismiss the situation of people with disabilities in a relationship of care, because any care policy needs to advance the autonomy and dignity of every person involved in the relationship. And we could see many ways in which the narrative and the message was really treating people with disabilities as furniture, and as a burden, mainly as a burden. So poor women who have to take care of people with disabilities, and people with disabilities basically preventing their mothers from having a life, and this kind of narrative that is all too well known for probably all of us in our contexts. I remember they released a video that talked about this woman who was working class, didn't have much of a job or an income, and she was talking like it was a terrible life to have. And of course, it was the way they presented it. I have no doubt that she's had it hard, especially in a country that has such bad social protection systems like we do in Colombia, and where the informal economy is the majority of the economy. So, of course, many families struggle financially. There is impoverishment, disability. Families with disabilities are more impoverished, just like anywhere else in the world. But from the policymakers' perspective, they really were not bringing in a disability perspective. So we kept pushing with this network, and they started shifting. I remember writing a Twitter thread criticizing this video that I'm mentioning, and it got some traction, which I was a little surprised by. And then we engaged in conversations with public officials from the Women's Secretariat in Bogota. Maybe 2-3 years later, the International Development Bank was decided to fund a project to look at the disability perspective. And prior to that, some colleagues, Monica Cortés and Felipe Pinilla and Jenny Guzman, who was also at the Women's Secretariat, did some research and published an article, did an academic analysis of the disability perspective in this care policy. So let me pause and explain a little bit about what the city's care policy was and the care platform. So basically, the concept is more of bringing to the different territories of the city all the services and creating manzanas de cuidado, meaning like care blocks. It's more or less the translation. And in these care blocks, women who are caretakers can come to request services. So it's both new services that were created for caretakers and regular social services concentrated in one specific block. This means that the various agencies of the city have to coordinate the provision of the services, and then new services are provided, like yoga classes, laundry, support, and other kinds of accompaniment, maybe some sports or things like that. So the International Development Bank decides to fund a research about the disability perspective in these care blocks. And they reach out to me, and we create a research team to look at the services that the blocks are providing and how they have where is the disability perspective in the way it's been implemented. So what we find is that services are segregated, that all services that are ableist and that still have a segregationist or institutionalizing approach still are in place. And that really it's very little acknowledged that women with disabilities provide care work. So the accessibility of the blocks is very low. There are a lot of issues with women who have children with disabilities and who are unable, like they basically treat them like children. So they do have daycare services, but they don't have any kind of support services for people with disabilities. So at the time when we went to the different blocks and visited and interviewed people, and also we created a visit by disability activists to a specific block where they did a tour and learned about it and asked very poignant questions. And out of that visit, we had really good feedback about and questions for the policies. So with that research project, also we were towards the end of the mayor's term, and the goal was to create enough of a solid research and recommendations so in the transition of mayorship, this could be taken into account. So I don't know where that is. But then some of the people who worked in the Bogota's care system were moved to the national under the vice president office, Francia Marquez, who's also one of the main points of our platform was care and recognizing unpaid work by women caretakers. So then we began a process of also engaging in a conversation about disability. And because of the work we had done with Bogota, we had good rapport with the vice president's office, and with then that office created consultancies to identify how a national care policy could impact a specific marginalized groups and like stakeholders. So they hired a consultancy about children, they hired a consultancy about older people, they hired a consultancy about community care, about racialized people, rural areas. And then they brought us to put together a team to analyze the demands and the support needs of people with disabilities. So we conducted research in 4 departments of Colombia, 2 of them very highly impacted by the armed conflict, one of them with a majority of indigenous population, another one with the majority of Afro-Colombian population. And we conducted 8 focus groups in this and about 10 interviews to identify specifically support needs. So with that research, we also provided recommendations for the national care system policy. Right now in Colombia, there is the care system policy in place, and the disability policy is being updated. So there's been a whole conversation between the two heads of the policies to coordinate. And one of the things that has come out is we don't have any kind of personal assistance system, but this is going to happen with the care support budget that they're assigning for the care system in Colombia. So I believe there has been big strides in terms of incorporating a disability perspective into the national care policy. And the few minutes I have left, I would like to mention also that in Latin America, there has been a significant move from the states after the pandemic to push for care policies in the various countries. And it is a struggle to incorporate a disability perspective into these policies. One win that is important is from the CEPAL meeting in Argentina, that which is the UN Latin American office. That statement, the whole meeting was focused on women and care policies, and the final statement includes the promotion of autonomy of people with disabilities in care policies. So that was also a result of advocacy by Latin American activists with disabilities who were present there in Buenos Aires for that to happen. Other countries that are discussing care policies include Mexico, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia. As far as I know, there probably are others that are outside of my knowledge. And at this time, with the leadership of Carlos Rios and Alberto Vázquez, Barbara Farias, other colleagues in the region, there's a recently created group that is discussing the question of care and supports. And that group created a statement that was sent for the COSP meeting this year. And this I think is important as a political alignment in the region. I think some of the questions that are kind of up for this discussion are: where is the place of peer support, and also how do the care policies link to the institutionalization policies and the institutionalization efforts? And I think that's not very explicit in the political debates. There's also the Global Alliance for Care that has brought in more interest in including a disability perspective. It's an alliance that brings in states and UN agencies, so it's more of a global effort. So it's a good forum to track in terms of what's happening. I think we still have a long way to go for the disability perspective to clearly be understood in the care and support systems, and for those policies to actually be about care and support. Of course, there's a history of rejection and resistance to the word care and the concept of care. And we all agree that the classic vertical way of understanding care is problematic and oppressive and has been oppressive. What I believe is that currently there are different approaches to understanding care. We all talk about mutual care, we talk about care of the planet, care of nature, and care within the family. So I think that there is a reconceptualization that is happening, and that is not coming from that place of care and cared for, but that there is an interdependency perspective that is present also when we bring in supports and care into the policy discussion. So our advocacy has been focused on, yes, there is a historic denial of the work, the unpaid work that women have done to support their families, their relatives, and their households. And that has to be acknowledged, and policies need to address that. And there's also a need to recognize that all policies that involve care and supports need to promote the dignity and autonomy of everyone involved in the relationship. So we are basically at this place. Colombia passed a care law that it was more of a populist response to demands. Unfortunately, we see also a lot of friction between independent living movements and family movements of caretakers. And this, I think, is a friction that harms us all. Because we are looking for the same interest of ensuring that every person has their own life project. So this is where the discussion is now. We are waiting to see where the decree goes in Colombia, where the policies will be approved later this year. So that's going to give us more light in terms of what is the budget allocated for the system, what are the services that are provided, and how they respond to the needs, the support needs that people with disabilities have, so they can fully participate in our community. So I hope we can continue this conversation. I'm happy to share the findings of the research projects I was part of and continue discussing with you what's needed for these to be a framework that supports people with disabilities fully living in the community in light of Article 19 of the Convention. Thank you all, and I hope to have many future conversations with all of you.
That was lovely to hear from Andrea, and I suppose a little, I don't know whether to say it's heartening or disheartening that the same arguments happen whether they're in Colombia or in Ireland. But I think what's heartening is that because we're talking to one another in events like the summer school, we get the answers to work and how to work together. And there was one thing she said that I thought was lovely, and a lovely way to look at the whole project is that we all have our own life projects that we're trying to fulfill. And I think that was a very nice way of kind of addressing issues of autonomy and independence, but that it is all of our life projects. So it was a lovely inclusive way of describing it. I'm very pleased now to hand over to Kaja. Kaja is a master's student in gender studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, but is Norwegian, so we'll get that clear. She has a degree in social work from Oslo in Norway. She is currently undertaking her master's in gender studies on the topic of LGBTQ+ adults with chronic illness using a CRIP theoretical framework. Her research interests are developed from her own lived experience and include chronic illness, neoliberalist welfare systems, queer and CRIP time, temporality, and resistance practices. And I'm really pleased to open the floor to Kaja today. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I also want to start with saying thank you to the university and to the Center for Disability Law and Policy for inviting me to speak and for hosting this wonderful summer school. I'm a bit of a theory nerd myself, and it's been so valuable for me to kind of expand with learning more about disability justice and like law and more like legal perspectives. So the way I will do this presentation is that I first will speak a bit about my own history and my own sort of route towards disability justice. No, disability studies, not justice, sorry. I will then be presenting some findings from my master thesis in gender studies. I'm still very much in the process of writing it, but I hope to submit this autumn. Yeah. I'm speaking today as a disabled and queer cis woman. I have lived with the chronic fatigue syndrome for more than 6 years now, for the first years, I was on full sick leave, and I was housebound and also actually bedbound for longer periods of time. However, over the years, I have been able to regain some of my energy and some of my well-being, which I'm very happy for, of course. Although my energy levels still fluctuate quite a lot, and I still need a lot of time to rest. My education in gender studies has provided me an opportunity to familiarize myself with critical disability studies and CRIP theory. However, even though gender studies is a very intersectional field and prides itself to be very intersectional, this, in my experience, rarely reaches beyond categories like class and ethnicity, which are, of course, important in themselves, but the category of disability has really been missing out, in my opinion, all the way. But I have tried to devote all my essays to explore different aspects of this field. I was also lucky enough last year to do an internship at Lund University in Sweden. This was a research project focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on the disability movement in Sweden. Finding myself as a disabled person has been profound for me. It has helped me shift the focus from seeing my own body as faulty to seeing how this understanding was a product of ableism. Today, I have come closer to acknowledging that my needs for rest and time off are valid, and that it's okay to have a slower pace. And I want to cite Audre Lorde, who wrote, I think she lived with cancer for about 10 years, so Audre Lorde wrote, "I respect the time I spend each day treating my body, and I consider it a part of my political work, a kind of training in self-love and physical resistance." Can I have some water? Sorry. No, I can just... So before I move on, I want to say a few things about chronic illness, as I realize that we haven't really discussed it that much this week, I think, although Fiona definitely talked about it yesterday in terms of endometriosis and PMDD. So, as disability scholar Susan Wendell notes, those of us with chronic illnesses do not fit into most people's picture of disability. And firstly, chronic illnesses are often invisible, and this forces us to kind of come out with our disability over and over again, and to remind other people about our needs. And further, chronic illness is marked by a high level of unpredictability, in the sense that symptoms and their intensity can vary greatly. Some days we feel like we can do it all, and other days pain, tiredness, and other symptoms are so pronounced that we can hardly make it around in our own homes. And I think all this can make it difficult for us to make sense of ourselves, our identities, and to claim our needs. And this is, of course, amplified in a highly individualized society like at least Sweden and Norway are, which are so absorbed with discourses on productivity and progress. And in addition, as has been mentioned before, I want to note that chronic illness is more common among women and also among LGBTQ+ people, making it a very feminist issue. So to sum up, I think that chronic illness as a disability brings up some new questions. For example, what does accessibility look like in relation to chronic illness? And we know that some chronically ill people will seek medicalization and even cures to ease discomfort and pain. And as Susan Wendell points out, this is in many ways at odds with the social model of disability. How can we understand this while at the same time fighting any pathologizing view on disabled people? And before I move on to talk about my research, I would like to read a short piece from Ellen Samuels, which has written a really beautiful and short text about crypt time. And she writes, "For crypt time is broken time. It requires us to break our bodies and minds into new rhythms, new patterns of thinking and feeling and moving through the world. It forces us to take breaks even when we don't want to, even when we want to keep going, to move ahead. It insists that we listen to our body-mind so closely, so attentively, in a culture that tells us to divide the two and push the body away from us, while also pushing our body towards its limits. Crypt time means listening to the broken languages of our bodies, translating them and honoring their words." So I will then go over to my master's thesis and present some of the findings from it, although I need to emphasize that it's really only a few of the findings. I have a very huge material of like 200 pages, so it's been quite challenging to kind of pick out a few parts. So I want to say a bit about the entry point and my specific way of framing the study. After coming to Sweden and to Gothenburg more than 2 years ago, I have found like-minded people who are also queer and living with chronic illness. And I find that chronic illness is so common among queer people in Gothenburg, as is also neurodiversity. And I started to see or sense that this group seemed to be navigating both heteronormative and ableist norms in a very specific way, different to what I had experienced back in Norway. And this made me want to study how these responses can be researched and theorized, and how we can understand agency within this group. I also want to say that I'm inspired by the Italian researcher Mara Pieri, who has written a PhD about sort of the same topic, about queer people with chronic illness, which she calls the chronic queer. She has written a book which is called The Chronic Queer, which I think is an interesting concept to propose. So I have interviewed 9 people, 6 are non-binary, 1 is a trans woman, and 3 are cis women. There was a huge demand, actually. More than 30 people reached out and wanted to participate. However, I could not do this because of time limitations and my own sort of limitations. And the sample consists of people with conditions like chronic fatigue, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, fibromyalgia, different psychosocial disabilities, and also post-COVID, to name a few. And 2 were also autistic, and 1 has ADHD. And in relation to methods, it was important to me to try to make the interview situation as accessible as I could. I did this by offering different modes of interviewing, which include meeting in person or online, speaking on the phone, or through written text. I also did this knowing that some people are so severely affected that they are housebound or bedbound. And I really wanted to try to also recruit these people. And a few severely affected people reached out to me, but unfortunately, we were not able to go further with these interviews. And I think of this as a limitation to my study. I also made sure to offer breaks during interviews and to bring some water and some snacks. And this turned out to be useful, not least for my own energy, actually, as many interviews could last up to 3, even 4 hours. So I will now present a few of the topics that were brought up in interviews. And one thing that really stood out to me was that almost all participants experienced that being chronically ill was much harder than being queer. And this may seem obvious in a country like Sweden, which prides itself on being one of the most gender equal and progressive countries in the world in terms of the rights of LGBTQ+ people. However, the rights of trans and intersex people are far from being met in Sweden. So on this background, I found it striking that being chronically ill was experienced to be so much more difficult than being queer, even for trans and non-binary participants. So the question is then, how can we understand these difficulties? And first of all, many describe that their health situation and their illness is not believed and supported by either doctors or the welfare system. In Sweden, you need a medical diagnosis to have the right to certain benefits and to have the right to economic benefits in the case that you are not able to work. And with such mistrust from doctors, many lived with a constant fear of losing their economic support. And several participants had also lost all financial support, forcing them to live off their partner, student loans, or private loans. I'm, of course, referring to people who are too unwell to work or who cannot work full time. And this is, of course, also a matter of very inflexible labor markets that are not tailored to people's needs for shorter days, more flexible working conditions, and so on. It was also quite clear that having a permanent job position was a huge benefit. And in many ways, it determined how well they are perceived and met in the system. And I think we can understand this through looking at the situation we're in with the Swedish welfare state. Since 2015, Sweden has intentionally built down the right to sick leave and to economic benefits. And scholars agree that the Swedish welfare state has turned to neoliberalism, with its emphasis on individual responsibility, work ethics, and a diminishing of the ethical principles that the Nordic welfare states were built upon, namely justice and solidarity. And one participant described that the mistrust from the system had led to a lot of internalized ableism for them and made them question their own worth and their own reality. So I will now be talking about experiences of being chronically ill and queer in various contexts. So in healthcare, participants described that in order to be taken seriously, they would have to choose between expressing their queerness or their illness. One person described it this way, and I will now read the quote. And it's hard to get doctors to listen to you if you're marginalized in some other way. And I have felt that I often have to choose between my queer identity and being sick. And that's probably why I think that this research is so important too. Because when you are disabled, you are very rarely seen as a whole person who has relationships, who has a job, and who needs to function in a society in the same way as everyone else. But often we are just either sick or we kind of have to try to hide the illness to somehow be taken seriously. And I find that part very sad and hard to live with. And this feeling of being too complicated, if you will, was a quite common experience, not only in healthcare, but also in family situations, relationships, and at workplaces. And they felt, complicated because they were both queer and disabled. And several held themselves back from seeking romantic relationships. They felt that they did not have the energy to do it, or that they didn't have anything to offer to a potential partner. And I'm now on kind of the last finding that I want to share with you. And this is something that I want to call CRIP and queer knowledges. Many participants share that being queer in some ways helped them to cope with their chronic illness. It seemed that queer people are already so used to navigating and resisting norms around gender and sexuality. And this seemed to have helped them develop an awareness around ableism too. And several described that they could see how systems of heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and ableism are almost built on the same oppressive framework. For example, one trans woman said the following: "You don't see a lot of essences in things when you're queer. Instead, you see a lot of norms and individuals who try to make sense of themselves and their experiences." And I think it becomes very easy to that you almost start to see the cis norm as some kind of ableism in a way. you see that bodies are supposed to be in a certain way. And that's where I think that categories bleed together. This is how they framed it. And along the same lines, another participant talked about how we often talk about intersectionality. We say that being, for example, queer and disabled means being twice as marginalized almost. And it's very important for me to say that several participants felt just that. But however, this person and also other persons share that it was in many ways the opposite for them. For them, being at this intersection provided them with insight and strength to think differently around norms. And in this way, they started to perceive their body in a different way too, and offering more understanding and care towards their body and their life. And needless to say, community was crucial in this regard. None of the participants felt that there existed like a formal organization that worked for their interests specifically. However, many of them have developed more informal communities, either in person or digitally, where they can share experiences and strategies. And this could be a larger group of friends and networks, Facebook groups, online groups, etc. And one participant described that queer and disabled people have a particular knowledge that comes from being marginalized. She said that as queers, we know that others may not have support systems in their family or in healthcare or welfare systems. We know that many live in precarious situations. And therefore, she said, the queers are devoted to reaching out and providing direct help, even to people they do not know. So to sum up, I found that participants were speaking almost of two different narratives, which I really think can exist at the same time for many of us. On the one side, they pose a strong critique on the systems of heteronormativity and able-bodiedness, and they have found ways of navigating and resisting them, both alone and in community. On the other hand, many still feel like they are a personal failure. And this, I believe, highlights how strong these ableist norms are, but also the more embodied experience of living with illness. And I would like to end my presentation with a short piece from Mia Mingus, who has written about solidarity, CRIP solidarity. And Mia Mingus says, "I want to be with you. If I can't go, then I don't want. If you can't go, then I don't want to go. If we are traveling together, sharing political space together, building political family together, then I want to be with you. I want us to be together. We resist ableism dividing us. I resist my disability being pitted against your disability. We will not be divided." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaya. That was really interesting. I absolutely loved the definition of CRIP time. I think it's something we could all probably learn from, that we listen to ourselves more. I appreciate that there is the distinction that you've no choice with chronic illness but to listen to your body. But maybe if we all listened to our bodies a bit more, we might have a better place in any event. And I also thought that it was really interesting that how you brought out the intersectionality, but particularly I thought the one around the doctors, going to the doctors, you could either be queer or you could have a chronic illness, that they could accept some element of difference, but not all the elements, and not actually recognising how complicated and multifaceted we all are as human beings. So it was really interesting, and thank you for that. I am now going to turn to our third speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Jennifer Byrne. Jennifer is a member of the advocacy team for the CBM Ireland, which is the Christian Blind Mission, and she's working on disability inclusive climate justice. Her role focuses on including people with disability in climate change movements. A big issue around that this morning all over Twitter, but we won't go into that. She had previously worked with other Irish and international development NGOs addressing development education to humanitarian action. She completed a BSc in International Development and Food Policy in University College Cork, which focused on disability inclusion for mainstream development organisations, and she's now undertaking a PhD here in Galway in the Centre for Global Women's Studies, and her research explores intersectionality between gender and disability in Cambodia and Rwanda, and how these identity factors impact income and livelihood opportunities for women with disabilities in both countries. And I'm delighted to hand over the floor to Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm not exactly the loudest speaker, but I am from Cork, which means I talk incredibly quickly, so I will try to slow it down. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to meet you all and hear all your perspectives on disability and gender justice, because I know I come at this topic from a slightly different perspective from the areas of practice and NGO work. And as Siobhan was mentioning, I have been doing my PhD here in University of Galway, for the last 4 years. So I'm almost finished that research. And now I also come at it from the perspective of a development practitioner working for CBM Ireland and working on the intersection of disability and climate. So apologies that I couldn't join you for the rest of the week. We were very busy in CBM Ireland working on the Conference of State Parties that's just finished up in New York, but I have been following what's been going on social media and everything, and I really appreciate being able to learn from all of the very interesting contributions that you've had so far. To give you a quick visual description of me for anyone who's visually impaired, I am relatively tall, I have long brown hair, and I'm very pale. I'm one of those Irish people who looks like they've never seen the sun before. So in terms of my research, I'm coming towards the end of my PhD here in NUI Galway, and I've been focusing, as Siobhan mentioned, on employment opportunities for women with disabilities, mainly focusing in Cambodia and Rwanda. So I'll tell you a little bit about that research work, and also how it has linked to the work that I've been doing in CBM in terms of the intersection between climate and disability. I'll explore a little bit into the methods that I've been working on, but to be totally honest with you, I'm a practitioner at heart. So I know you've all been speaking about all these interesting theories about disability and intersectionality, which I find fascinating, but in terms of my work, I've always been more interested in the practice and how to really apply it in an everyday context. With my work with CBM, I'm quite new to the role. Actually, I only started in CBM back in April, I think. So this world of climate and disability is quite new to me because I've always worked mainly with women with disabilities and in the intersection of gender and disability. So bringing in climate has sort of been a new element for me, and it's something I'll explore a little bit here, but I'm very much open to contributions and to learning from everyone else here who I'm sure has more experience in this world than I do. And just to mention, in terms of my own background, I come from the background of chronic illness as well, so it was very interesting to hear that contribution this morning. And my work has mainly focused on Cambodia and Rwanda, and in CBM Ireland as well, we focus mainly on the Global South. So that's more of the focus of my presentation, but I'm very interested to hear the perspectives of others and also to see the linkages that we can make between what's happening internationally and in the Global South and also what's happening here in Ireland. So I just noticed that there's actually quite an overlap between Kaya's work and my work here in terms of the intersectionality that we're talking about. And the main difference really is that I'm coming from the perspective of Cambodia and Rwanda and the Global South, and trying to link my work with women with disabilities a little bit more to the climate movement, because I feel like that's an area that hasn't necessarily been explored in the literature or even in practice as much as some of the other areas that we speak about. So as I'm sure you know, and kind of by way of introduction, according to the ILO, women with disabilities comprise about 15% of women worldwide. But what I found from my research is that this doesn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground. Because if you were to ask me, maybe, if I identified as a woman with a disability, I'm not sure that I would say yes. Because yes, I have a chronic illness, and yes, it impacts my life. But I don't know if it impacts my life on the day-to-day basis to such an extent that I would identify myself as a woman with a disability. So all this to say that in my research, I have found that there are always more people with disabilities present than we necessarily see or than we necessarily account for. And this has a huge impact on NGO programming, because if you're making programs accessible, you have to be aware that there are far more people in a community who may consider themselves to have a disability as may actually present as having a disability. So one of the main things that has come out of my research is this conversation around multiple discrimination. And I know there's huge debate and argument in the literature about considering it multiple discrimination, maybe calling it additive approaches and things like this. But what I found from interviews and from focus groups with women with disabilities themselves is that it's a reality for many people, that in a lot of the patriarchal societies that we as CBM work in and that I have been working in over the last few years, the reality is that the stigma and discrimination due to both being a woman and also have a disability tend to combine to disadvantage women with disabilities in a lot of these societies. It also means that a lot of the traditional roles associated with womanhood tend to combine with stereotypes around the causes and implications of disability to create a gendered experience of disability. And we see this even in Ireland, where in a lot of cases in rural areas, women are still expected to be in charge of the household, still expected to fulfill those reproductive roles, to look after children, to look after elderly parents. And where disability comes into play, there's sort of a confusion. I know Kaya was talking a little bit about the medical implications of disability, and that's something we face so often in Ireland as well, as women with disabilities who have to fulfill both these traditional roles as well as our roles as disabled advocates and whatever other roles we may fulfill within our lives and within society. And this is before we ever consider your age, race, your religion, class. All of these issues come together in any given society or any given context to create patterns of advantage or disadvantage. So how this all links to my research, essentially, is that what I've seen is that women with disabilities are at greater risk of poverty than men with disabilities. And this is because usually women with disabilities are lacking in opportunities for education and employment, and especially for skills development. In my research specifically, I worked with 36 participants across 2 countries. So 16 women with disabilities in Cambodia and 20 women with disabilities in Rwanda, as well as about 40 focus group participants and key informant interviews as well. And what I found in that research was that 73% of my participants were in employment, but wages varied hugely. And I found that about most participants in Cambodia would earn about $250 a month, whereas in Rwanda, most participants would earn around $50 a month. So I found this disparity really surprising, because in Rwanda, you know, the economy seems to be thriving. There are a lot of people in Rwanda who are doing very well, and the country is really beautiful, very well built up, but the inequality is so high that it means that people who are poor, who are on the margins of society, who are living with disability and living in poverty, earn so little that it's difficult for them to actually make a livelihood. Whereas in Cambodia, the inequality is so much less that people with disabilities find it easier to enter the labour market and they have lower barriers to entry into low-skilled markets, because low-skilled markets are often the most highly available types of jobs. So I saw as well that there's often unequal pay for equal work, which is also very relevant to Ireland, where people with disabilities would often be paid much less for doing the same job as people without disabilities, purely because they're seen to have a disability. And one participant in Rwanda explained to me that she was offered about €7 to do a job for a company, and when she turned it down, they offered it to a non-disabled employee who was offered $70. And the only difference in their identities was that this lady identified as disabled, whereas the other person who was offered the job did not. There was no difference in skills or the type of role that she was being offered. So in a lot of cases, despite this disparity and despite how women with disabilities are seen, they often can't afford to be unemployed due to the lack of safety nets that exist in a lot of countries. Women with disabilities are often more likely to work in the informal economy as well as manual labourers or vendors, because they're usually the most realistic options for earning money and contributing to the household. Employment, I found, is a key factor for the empowerment and inclusion of women with disabilities, because, as Kaya rightly mentioned, in a lot of cases, our respect in communities is dependent on what we can contribute, and it's dependent on how we can care for ourselves. So it was hugely evident in Cambodia and in Rwanda that respect in communities and that the way that people with disabilities, and especially women with disabilities, were perceived is related to what they can contribute to the economy and what they can contribute to the community. So when we're talking then about how this all relates to climate and disability, what I've seen from my work with CBM and sort of the connection with my research is that people with disabilities, and especially women with disabilities, tend to be the most connected to the land. They're usually the ones who hold the most indigenous knowledge, the most power over the land, because they're the ones who are often the farmers. They're the ones who are looking after the home. They're the ones who are caring for the agricultural crops. But we also know that people with disabilities living in low-income countries are the most at risk from climate change and often face serious threats to their lives, their homes, food security, mostly because they are the ones who are often at the cold face of climate change. People with disabilities report feeling less safe and secure during times of natural disasters, mostly because of increased food prices, mobility restrictions, and the isolation that they often feel in times of natural disaster. We also see an increasing negative impact on health and well-being related to climate change. And this is generally due to lack of access to healthcare during natural disasters, as well as lack of access to rehabilitation, medical facilities, and forced migration. This all sort of, in my head anyway, necessitates a rights-based and participatory approach to inclusion, to intersectionality, and to fostering this bottom-up approach of engaging women with disabilities, people with complex needs, in community building and in mitigation and adaptation towards climate change. What we need to see is the communities who are most impacted by climate change actually being involved in the discussions around climate change and how they can make a difference in what matters to them. So just briefly to give you an anecdote, CBM most recently did an analysis of 16 of the countries that we work in to understand how different countries in Ireland, in Europe, and in the Global South are honouring their commitments to the CRPD, and also to including people with disabilities in climate change. So we analysed the climate reports like the NDCs, the NAPAs, the NAPs, to understand if people with disabilities are involved in these high-level climate policies and climate action frameworks. And what we found is that countries very rarely include people with disabilities in their action plans. Only 2 of the 16 reports that we looked at mentioned people with disabilities in their climate plans, and none of them specifically referenced women with disabilities at all. And essentially what we've seen is that within the climate space, countries don't remember their commitments within the CRPD. They sort of have forgotten that people with disabilities are major stakeholders in the climate movement, but also within the country, that they have their own, or that we as activists have our own voices, that we have our own needs that need to be taken into account. So there's a disconnect between the disability movement and the climate movement, where essentially we're just not talking to each other. So how this all sort of links together, trying to link my research and work with CBM, is that women with disabilities tend to be the most affected by climate change. And individually and collectively, both in Ireland and in the Global South, we face accessibility and attitudinal barriers to participation in decision-making spheres, especially related to climate change. And this is because of the multiple intersecting identities that we hold. And what we found also is that there's so little research centering the experiences of women with disabilities in the climate crisis, even though, as I mentioned, we're the most likely to be the holders of first-hand experience of the impacts of climate change, especially because of the traditional divisions of labours that I mentioned earlier. And women with disabilities aren't sufficiently represented in climate discussions, and especially at these big global forums that we often have, like COSP, like COP. We need much more representation of people with disabilities with all these different intersecting identities to share how it is that we're affected by these things and to share how it is that we can move forward. So to finish up, I just wanted to share a couple of stories of hope from my research, because it can be very easy to get bogged down in all of this and to sort of feel that there's no hope, and especially in relation to the climate crisis, it's difficult to keep hopeful sometimes. So firstly, while I was working in Cambodia, I met a lady called Naret who runs the Siem Reap Food Bank. She has multiple complex impairments, but she has found a way to work across the disability and climate movements in Cambodia by setting up what's called the Siem Reap Food Bank. So the way that this works is that in her local community, in the rural areas around Siem Reap, the food bank is able to grow and deliver leftover food from grocery stores, restaurants, hotels, and things that they've grown in their own garden to local residents who live with complex impairments, who maybe live on their own, the elderly people in the community. And it's also been able to teach people in the community to grow their own drought-resistant crops, because it tends to get very hot in the summer in Cambodia. So there's been this community collective that's come together to engage in this Siem Reap Food Bank with absolutely no outside assistance. And they've been able to build themselves up and form this community of women who are essentially mitigating the effects of climate change that they themselves felt, and also minimising food waste. So the other organisation that I wanted to highlight is called Endorois Indigenous Women's Empowerment Network in Kenya. And this organisation works at the intersection of individual people. Sorry, I'm getting a little confused now. It works at the intersection of Indigenous people, climate smart agriculture, and human rights. So in this case, this Indigenous community is working with women and people with disabilities in a small community in Kenya in order to establish areas of climate smart agriculture and the establishment of tree nurseries which are tended by people with disabilities in this community, and kitchen gardens for improved livelihoods. So this is essentially a way for the Indigenous community, the community of people with disabilities, to come together as an entire community to work through climate smart agriculture together. And it's also been highlighting the need for access to land rights for people with disabilities, and how this can be taken further to the government level in order to promote sustainable solutions to climate change throughout Kenya. So that's everything that I would like to say to you today. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I appreciate it.
So thank you very much, Jennifer. There's a couple of things that struck me. I mean, one of the things you mentioned was that the climate plans you looked at, 16 climate plans, and only 2 mentioned people with disabilities. It reminded me of the project carried out by Teresa Degner here in the audience with Gerard Quinn, showing that human rights conventions generally didn't include people with disabilities. So hopefully the CRPD will start to bring change and bring that change that, or can impact that change. The other thing I think that was really important, and it's something that I think is forgotten quite a lot, is that the communities impacted by climate change must be part of that discussion. And that seems to be, that's not something that we see, at least we're not seeing here, is that the communities that are fundamentally impacted by climate change are the voices we should be hearing from in relation to that. Just looking back over the 3 papers, I mean, one of the things there that Jennifer mentioned were the levels of marginalisation for women with disabilities in both Cambodia and Rwanda. And I think that spoke very closely to what Kaya mentioned as well, that idea that societies place a huge value on productivity. So therefore, the more marginalised you are, that exacerbates your marginalisation, because we value our societies, our value in productivity over the point that Andrea made, is that we all have our own life projects, and our own life projects may be different. And so I think it's important to kind of maybe bring it back to that idea of a life project and not look at what the society is demanding of us, but what we want for ourselves in different situations.